Today in my driveway, I have a Lexus RZ 450e. It's the first all-electric Lexus, and let's be frank, it doesn't make the best case for itself based on the numbers alone. Let's talk about those numbers first. It starts just under $60,000. You'll get just over 300 horsepower and up to 220 miles of electric range. That is not range king by far in this segment. You will certainly find 300 miles or over in some of the competition. You'll also find lower starting prices and faster charging. That's been another direct complaint about the RZ and its sister ship, the BZ4X. They don't DC fast charge terribly quickly. This will get you over 100 miles of range in 30 minutes of DC fast charging, but 30 minutes in a competitive vehicle could give you well more than that. Most notably, the Genesis GV70 electrified. It will give you a little bit more range, 18-minute DC fast charging, and a whole lot more power. But the RZ, I would admit, after having spent a week with this vehicle, is more than just the sum of its numbers. But is it enough to change your mind? Let's find out. Although not without its faults, the styling of the RZ is certainly less controversial than the BZ4X, so that's definitely one reason you might want to upgrade from the related Toyota into the related Lexus. After having spent a week with this, I've actually grown to appreciate the front-end styling, mainly because it's definitely in keeping with the rest of the Lexus lineup, so it certainly looks like a member of the family. We have the same sort of blunt-nosed spindle grille design that we find in the new RX and the TX, etc. Some familiar cues like the Nike swoosh headlight here. The LED projectors are on the outboard side. These are DRLs on the inboard side. We have what look like aero fins over here on the side, but these are actually just styling and they just help merge that black panel from the headlight down there towards the front end. The only cooling going on is happening right over there, and again, no actual aero openings on these. Style-wise, I think the Genesis GV70 electrified looks more traditional with its absolutely enormous Superman grille, and I do think that the BMW, the Audi, and the Mercedes EVs are slightly more attractive than this, but they're also different in different ways. So we have that very buck-toothed BMW iX, and of course we have the very jelly bean-styled Mercedes. Those aren't exactly my cup of tea, but I think their designs are a little bit more harmonious than whatever this is. The first thing to know about the RZ is that it is not an electrified RX. They didn't simply take that gas model and jam a bigger battery under the body. And that means that the exterior panels and the interior are unique to this model. It also means that the dimensions change a little bit, even though this is theoretically the electric RX as far as its position in the lineup. Most notably, the length is about 3 inches shorter from tip to tail, and the roof height is also about 3 inches lower, although the ground clearance changes a little bit, so the box is actually about the same height as far as what you can fit on the inside. As is the legroom figure, because we actually have a shorter hood and a shorter hood profile up front, which gives us a bit more interior space than we find in the RX in some dimensions, and a cargo area in the back that's really about the same size. The rear end styling is definitely in keeping with the rest of the Lexus lineup. We get the signature LED swoosh here, and it runs from one side all the way across to the other. But unlike the RX and the NX, you'll notice that the greenhouse pinches in a great deal more than the body does. That definitely gives us a bit more of a wide-hipped, more athletic stance, but it also drastically reduces cargo practicality because that cargo area is a lot smaller, and you'll notice that there's actually a little bit less room between your head and the side windows in the back. And that means also that the rear bench seat is a little bit narrower than the Lexus RX, so if you plan on putting larger folks in the back or mixing adults and child seats, the Lexus RX is probably still going to be a bit more accommodating. And you can get the RX as a plug-in hybrid. At the bottom of the bumper, we get a pseudo air vent and then RZ450E badging, direct 4 badging as well because this is a dual motor model. The dual motor setup is a little bit different than we find in most of the competition, however. In the Lexus RZ, the more powerful motor is in the front, not in the rear. And the power difference is pretty large. You get about 100 horsepower more on the front axle than on the back, just over 300 horsepower total. So about 2/3 of the power on the front, 1/3 of the power on the rear. Lexus may be a bit adventurous when it comes to styling, but they're still a very conservative company when it comes to engineering and engineering philosophy. And that really explains a lot about the RZ. Having the bigger motor up front makes sense because greater regen potential can happen on the front axle. It also helps share parts with other vehicles that have a 200 horsepower motor up front. I kind of wish they'd also stuck a 200 horsepower motor in the back, but we can't have everything. Then there's the battery itself. This is nominally a 71 approximately kilowatt hour battery pack, but under 64 kilowatt hours of it is actually usable. And that is the big reason that the range figures come in relatively low, because considerably less of this battery is available to you than it is in a Genesis GV70, which is why the GV70 has slightly longer range, but considerably lower efficiency than we find in the RZ. Lexus honestly believes that we don't need to be driving around in big battery EVs. Although I fully expect them to give us one eventually, Lexus and Toyota have been pulled kicking and screaming into the big battery EV world, and that does make some sense. If you are only routinely driving 100 or 200 miles, why do you need an enormous battery pack? It wastes resources that could be used somewhere else. It also makes the vehicle more expensive and just heavier and more difficult to maintain, etc. On the other hand, a lot of people really want that extra range. So you have to decide, how bad do you want the extra range? Also, the reason we have so much battery reserve for longevity is because Toyota's design philosophy, again, very conservative, and like the BZ4X, they won't say this in a warranty kind of term, but they will say that this was designed to have very little battery degradation over 10 years. And that should put this in a relatively narrow category of vehicles likewise designed. Although in a lot of modern EVs, we haven't really seen much range loss over that 10-year and 100,000 mile window, Lexus is promising that we should see less out of this design because so much more of the battery pack is simply reserved for battery longevity. Front seat comfort's pretty solid and pretty similar to the Lexus RX. Over here we have a power multi-way driver's seat with just a two-way lumbar support. I would really love to see a four-way lumbar in more Lexus models. We then have a powered tilt telescopic steering column, and everything is memory linked with a 3-position memory over there on the dash. Like we see in a lot of Lexus models, the front passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It's lacking the adjustable lumbar support at all. Legroom and headroom is definitely good up front. I have maybe about 3.5 inches of headroom. This has the multi-pane moonroof, which we'll take a look at in a bit, but it definitely improves headroom for the driver and front passenger, so it certainly gives it that roomy feel. The seating position is pretty similar to the RX in that this is a bit more maybe wagon crossover meets sedan kind of driving position. You can raise this seat up actually really quite far because of the headroom and still have an acceptable amount of room and have it have a more upright feel. However, it does feel a little bit unusual versus the rest of the dashboard, your relative position in here. So you can do it thanks to the extra height, but it may feel a little odd. If you're a taller driver or taller front passenger, you'll also appreciate the fact that the front seat tracks move pretty far rearward. This driver's seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. This is all the way back in its tracks. As you can see, it comes quite far rearward, but there's still a generous amount of legroom in the back. The seat bottom cushion is a little bit close to the ground for my tastes. I think it would be a little uncomfortable for adults on longer road trips, but it is going to be more comfortable for children. Headroom, though, that is pretty fantastic. Again, thanks to the roof design here, even though my head is actually not above that glass or below that glass, I have about 2 inches of headroom left, so definitely very solid. We have a nearly flat floor in the back. It does have a very slight hump that has to do with some of the battery cabling infrastructure in the vehicle, and the rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, almost completely flat with the rear. You can also fold down the center armrest. You get 2 pretty typical cup holders there, air vents in the center console, and the outboard rear seats are heated. Thanks to the generous amount of room in here, I was able to fit a rear-facing child seat behind myself with the front seat comfortably in that position because, as you can see, there is quite a lot of room behind a 6-foot-tall driver. Again, though, keep in mind that seat bottom cushion is a little bit low, so you really are going to be lowering kids into the vehicle a lot lower than you might expect based on some of the competition. If you want to know more about child seats and their fitment in the RZ, be sure and check out that video that's coming up soon. If Lexus had just electrified an RX, we would actually get less cargo capacity than we do. Behind this hatch, we find just under 35 cubic feet of cargo space, which is about 5 cubic feet more than you'll get in the Lexus RX. Although the hatch is still pretty raked. So a 22-inch roller bag in this position, the cargo cover up here doesn't actually sit flat, and it is one of these flexible sort of fabric cargo covers rather than the more rigid style or the roller shade, which I do think is more convenient. This gives you a bit of an idea of kind of space we can get back here. This is a Kiko convertible child seat, so forward-facing and rear-facing. You could definitely fit a lot of luggage in the back. And in our 24-inch roller bag test, I was able to get 4 of those bags back here. The reason I could not get 5, though, is just the shape of this opening. It just gets way too narrow down here at the end. Size-wise, the big difference between the RZ and the RX is really going to be under the floor, because this is where we find approximately 5 cubic feet of storage space. You can see that there's actually kind of a divided nature to that underfloor storage well, and it's just about big enough that you could almost fit a 22-inch roller bag in that well. It's just a little bit too small. However, you can toss an awful lot of other items there under the floor that you wouldn't be able to in the RX. The design of this interior is significantly more conventional than the one in the BZ4X. There are a few things borrowed from the Lexus RX as far as parts and general style, but the dashboard itself is quite unique, especially over here on the passenger side where we have this really thin profile. That's possible because we don't have a glove compartment. Not quite sure about that choice, but it does give us that really slim look. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's take a look at the ceiling first because we have kind of a cool button up here. It's this one right there. That activates and deactivates the electrochromatic dual pane moonroof. You can see there's actually 2 panes there, and this is real speed as far as its reaction. It activates very, very quickly because it's essentially a big LCD sort of thing up there in the ceiling. Very similar technology actually causes that to diffuse the light. It's not going to really darken as much as I might like, but it certainly diffuses the light more, and it makes me a little bit happier about that than some of those glass roofs that don't have a shade. And speaking of not having a shade, there isn't one. That really is all you get. Back there in the rear passenger area, you can see that rear passenger heads are actually above that fabric section of the roof, but over here up front, depending on your seating position, you'll actually be more or less above that glass, which is why we have so much headroom. This interior has an interesting combination of materials. It definitely feels premium, but it feels quite different from the other Lexus interiors. You can see this is sort of a faux suede material on the seats. It's perforated because the front seats are both heated and ventilated. We have somewhat moderate bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushions, so larger folks shouldn't have too much trouble with them as far as the size goes. One downside to this type of fabric, as you can see, is that it does show lines and fingerprints relatively easily on it. I'm actually surprised that Lexus didn't give us more adjustable seats either, so there's no extending thigh cushion, no 4-way lumbar support for the passenger. Moving over to the front doors, lots of premium materials again. The imitation leather upper, imitation leather armrest, and then more of that faux suede right there in the in-between. At the bottom of the door, we find some hard plastics to help improve durability. Moving over to the dashboard, you can see the effect of the no glove compartment. We have a very, very slim dashboard. Under that, we actually have a heater pad. This is a radiant heater element. It's going to direct heat at your legs, so it's going to make your legs feel warmer than the ambient air normally would. That's definitely kind of a cool touch, but not having a glove box, I think that's a little bit odd. It does, however, make the dashboard look really low on the passenger side, and the dashboard extraordinarily high over here on the driver's side. That's definitely a look that they deliberately engineered into the vehicle. Up here we have the start-stop button, we have 2 big air vents, and then the really big touchscreen LCD infotainment system. As you can see, it supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. It also does that wirelessly, although I happen to be plugged in at the moment. You can see we have the native Google mapping interface right there, controls for the dual automatic climate control zones. Over here we can adjust the heated seats and the heated dashboard right there. Kind of a cool way that they link those two together. You can also leave it in an auto mode where it's automatically going to do that for you. We have a bunch of different eco-focused options for the climate control to help improve your range, just as you'd expect. Then down here, we have an automated parking button. That's right next to the 360-degree camera button, and this does use augmented reality for that 360-degree camera, so it will give you spinning views, etc. There are a bunch of different views that you can navigate around the vehicle. You can kind of get a bird's eye view there as well. We then have 2 USB charge-only ports, a USB interface port for the CarPlay, and then a really large wireless charging mat there that had no problem charging through the thicker case on this iPhone 15. Down here we have the rotary style shifter. You put your foot on the brake, push it down, and then rotate around for drive, rotate the other way for reverse. Park is that button right there. Down here we have some other buttons: stability and traction control, auto brake hold, pull for that electric parking brake, and then 2 big cup holders. One thing to know, there's no one-pedal driving in this vehicle. Moving back from there, we have a center armrest that opens to the side. This gives us access to a pretty deep storage compartment, but there is a little bit less storage going on in here than I might like. Under the center console, we do have a small storage area. That's currently where the vehicle's instruction manual is located, but as you can see, it's not a terribly tall area, and this is the place where we would find one 12-volt outlet. Over on the driver's side, we have a full color heads-up display, and then as you can see, a very eccentrically shaped dashboard over there. Then in the middle of everything, we have a surprisingly small LCD instrument cluster. What's surprising about this is you can actually get much bigger full LCD instrument clusters in something like a Toyota RAV4 now, and in here, this is approximately 7 inches, but the bezel is quite large, really making that screen feel a little bit smaller than it otherwise is. The steering wheel is pretty similar to the ones found in other Lexus models. On the top of the column, we find part of the driver monitoring system. We then have paddles on the back of the steering wheel to control the regenerative braking. Over here, we find touch-sensitive controls that are also contextual. You actually have to use the heads-up display in this model to really see what those buttons are doing. We then have volume up, down, and then we have some other contextual buttons over here. This changes what the buttons actually do, and again, you'll actually see that in the heads-up display. Heads-up displays are notoriously difficult to film, but you can see the touch-sensitive nature of those buttons and how you change them is actually displayed up there in the heads-up display. In the middle of everything, we have what looks like a stitched airbag cover. I think it is excellently done, but it is in fact not a stitched airbag cover. It is just a hard injection molded plastic. Don't worry, the driver has not been left out of the radiant heating party. That's what this little panel right there on the bottom of the steering column is for, and as you can see, it actually does move with the steering wheel in and out. When the driver's heated seat is on, it's actually going to be radiating heat right at your knees as well. Out on the road, the RZ is really defined by the engineering choices that Lexus made when it came to designing the drivetrain, specifically the bigger motor up front, the smaller motor in the back. Acceleration times are actually relatively peppy in the Lexus lineup. This model went 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds, and it stopped from 60 back to 0 in 115 feet. Both pretty decent scores. But there is a difference about how this accelerates. If I floor it here in a straight line, we don't get all the power until about 25 miles an hour or so, and we do feel just a little bit of front wheel slip. The reality is, with the motor setup in this vehicle, they really couldn't ramp power more rapidly than that. They're probably maxing out the rear electric motor before the front electric motor, and that's why there's not too much torque steer. There is still a little bit of front wheel tug, but it's not bad. If they had swapped the motors around, then this probably could have ramped power more rapidly, and they could have gone maybe 4.2 seconds, 0 to 60, something like that. Something closer to, say, an Ioniq 5 with all-wheel drive, because its horsepower total is about what we find here, except that its motors are the reverse of this. More powerful motor in the back, less powerful motor up front. The result is that this does have fairly predictable driving dynamics. You can floor it around the corners. It's going to feel an awful lot like a Lexus RX, where more power is happening on the front axle. But it's never going to feel rear power biased, because unless we're talking about relatively low speeds, low throttle applications, it can't be. It just can't send that much power to the rear axle. Maximum power output, again, always going to be 2/3, 1/3 approximately front to rear. The other side to that, however, is that we get pretty aggressive regenerative braking in this vehicle, excellent blended braking, and excellent wet weather and slippery weather performance to the regen braking. In general terms, you want the majority of your braking to happen on the front axle. It improves vehicle stability, especially in inclement weather, snow, rain, ice, etc. That motor imbalance is why I'm going to give this a B when it comes to handling. Now, Lexus did do some interesting things with the platform. They've given it wider tires in the back, 255s in the back, 235s up front, and they have programmed this to send a lot of power to the rear in low power demand situations. So, for instance, on this tight winding road here, if I stick my foot in it a little bit, we actually get a little bit of rear end rotation at lower speeds, because it can send 100 horsepower to the back and maybe 0 or 5 horsepower up front. But if you dig deeper into the throttle, that rear power bias gives way to a front power bias that we don't find in those other asymmetrical EVs. So it really is an interesting combination of feels out on a smaller winding road like this. If you're out on a larger, more sweeping road, then it's definitely going to have more of a traditional, I guess, Lexus RX, Lexus NX kind of driving vibe. I would say it's more fun than either of those vehicles just due to the instant power delivery, but it's not going to be that next level of fun where we find a GV60, GV70, Model Y, etc. I'm also going to give ride quality a B. This suspension is tuned a little bit more firmly than the Lexus RX, and this model does not have an adaptive air suspension, so you can't make things softer or firmer when you want to. I would love to see a model like the RZ get standard adaptive dampers. I think at the very least that would be a great fit for this vehicle. I would also love to see what Lexus could do by adapting an adaptive air suspension to this vehicle, say something like one borrowed out of the Lexus LS. A lot of EV manufacturers are actually putting adaptive air suspensions in their vehicle because they can help compensate for the added weight of the battery pack while also giving you adaptive damper functionality. Likely due to the relatively wide tires, this cabin is not as quiet as I had expected. I measured 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which definitely makes this among the louder EVs that we've driven, and a little bit louder than the BZ4X that we last tested. It's obvious that Lexus was very focused on efficiency in the RZ, not necessarily range. And that's obvious when we take a look at the real-world efficiency numbers, the fact that we have the heat pump system under the hood, and these radiant panel heaters, which are a really novel answer to heat consumption, especially in cooler weather. Now, how well they will function in, say, 30-degree weather, I don't know, but in the mornings here, it's been about 40 degrees, and they heat up quickly, actually more quickly than you would otherwise be able to heat a cabin by air. I actually just turned it on, and I can already feel some heat radiating in front of that element on my legs. And it really makes you able to set the temperature in the cabin a little bit lower than you otherwise would, definitely dragging out your range a little bit further. In our real-world range test, I had no problem getting 230 miles out of this battery pack. At the moment, pricing on the RZ450e is pretty straightforward because there's only one way to get your RZ basically, and that's the dual motor all-wheel drive version, but you can change around the interior components and features a little bit. That's why we have a fairly narrow pricing range. It starts just under $60,000, goes to just over $67,000, so pretty narrow range. There are a few key things to keep in mind, however. And these are pretty important for a lot of EV shoppers, I would say. We do have the smaller than average battery pack, 63 kilowatt hours approximately, the slower DC fast charging, 150 kilowatts. I think for most folks, the slower AC charging is going to be a bigger problem, 6.6 kilowatts versus 11 kilowatts for most of the EV competition. And then, of course, that lower range figure as well, 220 to 196. Now let's take a look at the competition because of course, these numbers mean nothing unless you're comparing them to somebody. The Model Y, it starts significantly less, $45,380, and it will get the federal tax credit, including in 2024. Not all the federal tax credit details are clear for calendar year 2024, but Tesla is one of the first companies to announce which models may and may not receive the credit and exactly how much credit they're going to get. So lower sticker price, but rear-wheel drive, but it's going to get the tax credit on purchases. Leases, of course, that's going to depend on the lease company. Some companies will pass it along, some companies won't. Range, honestly, it's not too different. 260 miles of range is what the Tesla Model Y rear-wheel drive is rated for. And remember that if Tesla was using the same rating calculations as everybody else in the industry, that number would probably be lower, probably 240 to 250 miles of range. So still higher than the RZ, but not as different as you might think. On the other hand, the RZ definitely charges slower. Theoretically 150 kilowatts, it's going to be a little bit difficult to achieve in the real world. When we plugged ours in, or the tester that we had troubles hitting 105 kilowatts. But pretty much every Model Y I have ever tested basically hits their numbers. The small battery pack in the Model Y is going to peak out at 170 kilowatts, not 255 like you find in the others, but that is still notably faster. Then, of course, you could get the all-wheel drive model with the long-range battery pack, etc., and charging is definitely going to be speedier. The big thing you'll notice is that the Model Y is certainly roomier. Now, on the other hand, the roominess comes at a cost, and that cost is ride quality and isolation. The Model Y is pretty bouncy. It's definitely got that firm, bouncy thing, can sometimes feel a little bit darty out on the road. The RZ feels basically like you'd expect a Lexus to feel. Now, I will have to temper that a bit by saying it's a little firmer than you might expect a Lexus to feel, but in the EV space, generally speaking, a lot of EVs tend to be a little firmer on the suspension tune, and I would say it still has that Lexus vibe. Now, if you're looking for something that's deliberately not a Tesla, you might want to take a look at our next option, and that would be the Genesis GV70. Honestly, the GV70 is the kind of vehicle that Lexus could have created, and I wish they would have created. Basically, what Genesis did for the GV70 electrified is they took a regular GV70, the gasoline model, they sort of cut off the bottom of the vehicle, and they inserted a battery pack and a new floor pan in the vehicle. And that means it has eGMP platform electronics, motors, etc. stuffed inside the rear-wheel drive Genesis GV70 platform. Price-wise, it's within the range of the RZ, sort of. It starts at $67,595, tops out at $74,950. But you're getting a lot more for your dollar because whereas the Lexus starts with just over 300 horsepower. The GV70 starts with 483 horsepower standard. And it starts with a little bit more range, 230 approximately miles of range. But because it uses the more modern drivetrain system from the Hyundai Kia Genesis conglomerate, it gives you 18-minute 10% to 80% DC fast charging. And if you want to go 0 to 100%, use up that entire 230 miles of range, it'll only take you 45 minutes to recover that 235 miles of range. That is a key thing to remember, because if you compare the short range GV70, I would call that relatively short range, to say a 300-mile rated EV, especially a 300-mile rated Tesla, which may have difficulties actually achieving 300 miles in the real world, that 10% to 80% charge time is going to be 35 to 45 minutes, depending on the version of the Tesla, the model you're looking at. And in that same 45-minute window, where you're only gaining 70% of your range back, you could gain 100% of the range back in the Genesis. So that is a pretty big advantage. I also think that the interior is more my style. It's more traditional. It's more luxury car general. We have the ability of stitched leather components on the dashboard, on the doors, on the steering wheel, etc. You can get a 3D LCD instrument cluster. I think the software is more attractive on the infotainment system. And you can get faster AC charging as well. So just your daily driving, charge it at home, plug it in, it's going to charge significantly faster than the Lexus, about 40% faster or so. Now, also on the more traditional front, I would say, is the Audi Q4 e-tron. It is a dedicated EV platform, but the style of the Q4 is certainly very traditional Audi. It's basically a Volkswagen ID4 platform that's been Audi-ified. So the interior has the Audi infotainment systems in it. It has Audi fit and finish here and there, Audi construction. But the core of it is still the Volkswagen ID4. So it starts as a rear-wheel drive vehicle. It is relatively softly sprung. It has a very different kind of driving dynamic than the RZ. It also is fairly upright and fairly boxy. So that definitely improves the practicality. Now, what if you like the RZ, but you want to stay with a Japanese brand? I would say take a look, oddly enough, at the Nissan Ariya. The last time I was in an Ariya, it was the top-end platinum trim with the suedette, or imitation suede, whatever you want to call it, dashboard sections, door inserts, etc. The interior in the Ariya honestly comes across as a bit more Lexus-like than the Lexus RZ. It doesn't get real wood, but the fake wood on the dashboard actually has a nice, attractive look to it, and the way they've integrated the touch buttons and touch controls into that wood, I think actually really works for me. You'll also find hands-free driving in the Ariya. Oddly enough, the Ariya is the only Nissan product to offer this particular feature, and at a relatively lower sticker price than the Lexus hands-free driving system Teammate in the Lexus LS. So for about $61,000, you can get one of the very few hands-off-the-wheel automated steering assistance systems in the United States. It functions kind of like Blue Cruise and Super Cruise. As far as its functionality goes, I would say it's a bit closer to Super Cruise than Blue Cruise, but it's right adjacent in that window. The Ariya starts less expensive at $44,555, giving you pretty similar range to the Lexus, but you get a bit more if you step up to the bigger battery pack. You get 257 miles of range in the Platinum trim for $61,000. As you'd expect, there are certainly some areas where the Ariya does not feel as premium as the Lexus, but the instrument cluster is not one of them because it is definitely bigger than the display we find in the RZ. Mainly it's in the further reaches of the dashboard or the lower portions of the dashboard, some of the lower door panels. They just don't have quite the same kind of precision, the same sort of soft edges and clean edges that we find in the Lexus. You can tell it's a less expensive vehicle. On the other hand, it feels roomier in the back seat, a bit more comfortable in the back seat, and I think the cargo area is a tiny bit more practical as well. If my cash were on the line, I would say it's pretty hard to go wrong with the Tesla Model Y. That's certainly going to be the best value pick in this segment. It's going to be the can't go wrong with option. If you're not a fan of Tesla and you deliberately don't want to get a Tesla, and you're taking a look at some of the other options, then I would say it's a much trickier choice because the RZ is not as uncompetitive as some people might think, outside, of course, of that Tesla envelope or some of the newer 800-volt EVs out there, like, of course, the GV60 and GV70. And I would say you probably would do well to take a look at the GV60 and GV70 if you really want something that is different from the Tesla Model Y. But also the Nissan Ariya, I think, is worth a strong look. Nissan hasn't been selling too many Ariyas, and it seems like there are some deals to be had at the Nissan dealer lot. And I would say if you're happy with the Lexus, you probably would be fairly happy with the Aria as well. I do like the way that it rides, and as far as all-wheel drive performance, just general vehicle performance, etc., it's not a world away from the Lexus. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would you pick if your cash were on the line? And if you are a Tesla fan, think about this in maybe the light of someone that would want to shop for a Lexus instead. If you're a Lexus shopper, let me know what you think about all that as well. In the meantime, find me at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the other social places. I'll see all of you next week.